Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fauscette. Each week, we interview experts in artificial intelligence, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. Welcome to the April edition of AI Pulse. I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host, Tom Pringle, Director of Pilot Research. Tom, glad to see
Michael.
you again.
Hello,
We're gonna do what we usually do on these: go through the news that we've seen lately and talk about how that impacts businesses. And of course, I have a little story I wanted to tell up front because I've been playing around with, and this won't surprise you, but I've been playing around with agentic AI for for a while now. But I found I know it's a surprise, but I found a platform I've been playing with called lindy.ai, and it's interesting because it comes with a lot of templates and things. So I have a bunch of different agents doing things. But one of the ones I've been playing with is, and the point of my story, is this one that it's an AI news tracker. It sends me a little summary of the news every morning to my inbox, that it monitors, and and it's kind of interesting because it's very simple. It goes like, summarizes key takeaways, market development, strategic implications, and then it gives you some recommendations, which I don't really understand where they come from. It sounds like it's trying to help me invest, but anyway, whatever. But my point was that I'll read you a couple of the things that it says, which won't surprise anybody. The AI market is experiencing a significant shift towards AI, agentic AI technologies. Major tech companies are continuing to strengthen their AI portfolios. We're going to talk about some of those. ChatGPT continues to dominate conversational AI space and recent updates and improvements. New wave of AI revolution is predicted to transform various sectors of the economy, and agentic AI is emerging as a distinct investment category within the broader AI market. So if you're looking to invest, apparently my AI agent thinks that you should think about agentic AI.
So is this particular agent covered by, kind of the SEC or whatever in terms of giving advice?
That's a good question, and I don't actually know the answer. But I didn't even give you the recommendations because, believe me, it has consider diversifying AI investments across both established players and emerging specialists. Interesting. Anyway. But my point was the summary of agentic, and I thought that was it's, of course, it said that now most every day, but that would be the story.
It's a pretty big headline kind of story. That's totally fair. And I think my comment about whether it was covered by the SEC is more to do with the fact that agentic AI, saying agentic AI is a big thing. It's like.
Well, I mean, so is air travel.
Weird conflict of interest.
Right. Well, so, and speaking of like big things, this one jumps out from the last couple of weeks, and I don't know why, but somehow it feels like every AI Pulse show I'm saying something about this. But OpenAI raised another round.
Well, it is the one of two or three continuous, a little bit like your new agent toy, one of the continuous themes.
Well, I mean, yeah, and when you raise a round that's the size of this one, I mean, $40 billion round at a $300 billion post money valuation.
So it's quite a lot. Quite a lot
Wow.
of money.
It is a lot of money, and I don't remember what the last one was that we talked, because I know Entropic was probably the show before this. They closed another round, but it does go to show you a lot of things. One of them being that it is expensive to build a serious
There is
AI
saying it's not a small amount of money is an understatement. Saying it's expensive also seems like a bit of an understatement as well. I mean, Friday, it's understatement Friday. I'm good with it. Exactly right. And it's just so funny though, isn't it? Because we do talk about this on a regular basis, the sheer volume of investments kind of flowing in.
Yeah.
My understanding as well on this one was that, correct me if I'm wrong, there was some portion of this money was meant to go to the Stargate project, which is this kind of group of AI centers, data centers around the US. So, I mean, clearly, it's not a low cost, not a low cost industry to be in.
No, I did see I didn't put this story in, so I won't talk about it much, but I did see that there's some movement in the NVIDIA competitors with some new different types of chips that they think are gonna significantly lower the cost there, but I guess we'll see, right?
Yes, I have no additional comment to say other than yes to that. We will see.
Well,
I think
yeah, and I should have probably put that, in the, list because it was an interesting article, but I got lost there for a minute.
no
Well,
worries.
so
But what
one of
go on, just to that point, though, just it's interesting because it's actually another thing that we've talked about previously, which is kind of we had this commoditization of hardware. We've now got this more specialization of hardware, and I wonder whether we're going to see in the world of AI specialized chips something similar going on, where there's going to be even more specialization,
the
and then probably some commoditization, and then and so on and so ad infinitum.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of moving parts here, and I I will say the other piece of this that we haven't, and I don't want to talk politics at all, but I will say that the change in the global economy from the tariff initiatives is also causing some disruption around who's doing what to whom and when. And I mean, the simple one, obviously, when when you hear that an iPhone is going to cost $4,000 or something if you make it in the U.S., then you know. But I mean, my point is that I think there's other shifting dynamics around who's making the chips and how much they cost and et cetera. So, but
I can make
things
the joke
change.
at this point, which is what tariff stuff? I've not seen anything in the news about that.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Uh,
Yeah,
but
unless you live under a rock, this one's no
yeah,
surprise.
I mean, the village I
Yeah.
live in is quite small, I guess. So no, but indeed, and I think that there's just so many different factors. When we had, even think back to COVID and the Panama Canal getting a boat stuck in it, or a boat
Right.
getting stuck in the Panama Canal. Probably is the more correct way of saying it. Um,
I mean, that is sort of the fundamental base of what happens, but anyway.
Uh, I, I think we are experiencing some supply chain challenges as a result of a very different form, but with no less real implications.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Well, so let's jump to other stuff that's more interesting because I would just get depressed if I think about the tariff thing again. So, one of the tools that is getting a whole lot of discussion and use and testing and et cetera has been retrieval augmented generation as a way to
Mhm.
ground large language models,
Yep.
RAG. Um, and and I thought it's interesting because one of the things, and the more complex the systems get, the more difficult it is. But it's very difficult to measure the performance of RAG once you've implemented it. In other words,
Mhm.
there wasn't really a good kind of framework to to work from in a sequence of tests that would actually give you confidence that what you did what works actually. But there's a new open source framework put out. Let's see, it's Vectara was the vendor that developed it. But it's interesting because it looks at four things that are extremely important in this: hallucination detection, of course, citation, so how accurate is it when it pulls things, auto nugget, which is the presence of essential information nuggets from source documents. So, in other words, how much of the important information did it retrieve? And then something they call umbrella, unified method for benchmarking retrieval evaluation with large language model assessment. I think umbrella is a good way to talk about that one. Whew, that's a mouthful. But my point was that there's now and looks like an accurate way to measure the performance of RAG as it's deployed, which I think is pretty. It was important, of course, but it's also really interesting.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of takes I had on it, I guess, and it was interesting as well. You mentioned the vendor. I think they were also in collaboration with an academic group
Right.
as well, which is cool. I think the take I had on it a little bit was it was a lot of human effort and work, and probably quite difficult, nay, questionably impossible to do. And this is the way of automating it, right? And the nugget approach, apparently, when I think about nuggets, I think about chicken, and I think about gold. But
Mm.
apparently, the approach is not new. It's just the way they're doing it is different, and it's become, kind of using the large language model to automate and all that kind of stuff. Is kind of really interesting, because my
Yeah.
understanding is a lot of businesses who are messing around, experimenting, investing, whatever you want to call it, with RAG, to kind of enhance the responses of AI output, have really struggled to monitor the performance of them. And just like,
Yeah.
is it
Yeah.
making stuff up, for
Yep.
example?
Well, yeah, and you think about it. I mean, that's a fundamental question when you're talking about a RAG implementation, because that's the point, right? You're trying to ground the model so it doesn't hallucinate, and obviously other things, giving it context in a safe way, and you know,
Yeah.
but it is, but I think it has been a very difficult thing, and especially if you talk to companies that have gone through proof of concept, or are going through proof of concept, one of the things they you kind of get to it, if you go into it in a really typically structured implementation way, which you should, then you've got to think about each of those component parts, and there's almost no system that uses a large language model that hasn't been implemented with RAG. I know of a few vendors that have done a different sort of, more of a prompt engineering approach to the context instead of RAG, but that's very unusual.
Mm.
Like Sugar CRM does a prompt engine, basically, that strips out PII and also pulls in context, and but that's rare. I mean, you see RAG across almost everything. So if there's no easy way to test that as a part of the component pieces of building the system out, which you need, then that I mean, this was definitely a critical need.
Yeah. I'm, Again, I'm limited to the response of yes. I think you
I mean,
said it all.
but it's a good response, I think.
And classically, I can get on one of my usual sort of soapbox moments and talk about transparency and explainability in AI.
Yeah,
And I think, the less these systems are a black box, and the more that we can instrument them and measure performance and assure ourselves, that it's not either A, talking nonsense, or B, being misleading,
right.
or whatever. It's got to be a good thing, especially if you're plugging it into like customer service solutions or something like
Right. Well, I
that.
mean, obviously, you fundamentally have to have the right context, and how you pull that together in a safer way, rather than training the model and everything. Because that's really underneath the the part of the problem, is you can't train the model on everything, nor should you, because there are things you don't want in the model, right? And so using RAG, it has become pretty standard across that. But now with some open source way to a framework to actually
Mhm.
measure the performance, hopefully that helps companies more quickly move through POC and get into production. Right. The other change, and I've written a little bit about this because I find this really interesting, and it actually, that summary, news summary, mentioned this a little bit too, or hinted at it, and that's this shift into multi-agent systems, mass multi-agent system, and I saw this article this week that Google, with a bunch of other vendors, had come out with this A to A, agent to agent interoperability protocol, which is supposed to standardize communication. Now, the problem, or the opportunity and the problem, of course, was that if you go into a multi-agent system, you want them to be able to collaborate. But if they're multi-agent from different vendors, they don't necessarily, or that you wouldn't know if they would, right? But if you, the more you're breaking tasks down, which I think is important, the more you understand the process, the more you break the tasks down for the different agents, and make the agents more specialized, the more important it is for them to communicate. And there's not it hasn't been a standard, really. So this, I thought, was an important development, because that's going to be more and more what you're talking about, agent to agent.
Yeah, I think that one's a really interesting. I believe there's a couple of other standards out there. This
Mhm.
Google A2A announcement. There's a lot of big names that they're in partnership with. I saw like Salesforce and
Yep.
ServiceNow. So some pretty significant industry players. amongst others, of course. And it's interesting because it put me in mind of an article I wrote 7 years ago, 6 years ago. I can't remember. But I called it at the time, it's when machine learning was starting to be kind of infused into applications in various points. At various points, I talked about super system AI, which was like the orchestration of multiple AIs into a bigger, more complete solution. And I think this is exactly what we're talking about here. And it unlocks, we can't possibly think it's a good thing that there's only one vendor out there with one set of agents that's going to do everything for us all the time. I suspect that's possibly not great from a competitive perspective or an innovation perspective. And we all know that lots of different companies have lots of different technologies in their stack. So the idea that you can have an open platform that allows interoperability, specialization, handoff, it feels, I don't know, it just feels right, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
It also feels like, I'm going to be a little bit mean. I'm just a little bit mean, because it's agentic out. I like to be a little bit mean. It also feels like RPA on steroids, so robotic process automation on steroids.
I, yeah, so that's an interesting, and I had a really long discussion this week with founder CEO of a Salesforce partner company that has done a decent amount of work with AI, agentic AI particularly, and we get to the point where we started to think about this as, oh, there are a couple of things that came out of it. One is, I think people that the definition of agentic and when does it go from RPA to agentic, which is your point, right? When is it autonomous and when does it have agency and et cetera? It's a continuum, and I was actually trying to build some models in each of those, kind of snapshot the different layers, because there's at least 5 different ways you can think of it, all the way from logic based to completely autonomous and with full agency, which is the other end of that thing. And part of what we were talking about, because again, multi-agent I think is the way it's going to go, and so A to A is an important protocol, and at least having some sort of standard that a lot of the vendors buy into, obviously, because that's always been an issue. But the other thing that kind of came out of this, and I the more I think about it, because like if you think about the agent exchange, so we've got marketplaces, you're starting to see them. I mean, I mentioned Lindy, they've started to have a partner marketplace. You're hearing about them across all these different things that eventually you really do have to think about this, in my mind, like a digital workforce. And if you do, then that means you're doing everything from, when I want to get an agent, what do I do? Well, I require a job description. I require a understanding of the process that it's going to go into, and et cetera. Right. So I think that we're still evolving in that, but I think if we start to think of it that way, it makes it a little easier for the companies to start to plan how they're going to run through this and how they're going to continue operating, right? What kind of workforce management system do we have for agents? Well, we have a couple of vendors that are trying to bring them out, but it's not mature yet, but it's an interesting idea. Marketplaces, job descriptions. I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
Well, it takes me back to one of the first topics I ever covered as an analyst, hilariously. Workforce management software in contact centers.
Yeah.
It's just interesting because the alignment there is quite good. And yeah, I think when you look at the approaches of having, I need a job description, I need an agent's description. And I need to understand the process it's doing. I need to understand. I think it probably highlights a big need for documentation around that. So we've all been very familiar in the world of IT that someone builds this system, whatever this system is, and then leaves, and oops. So
Right.
the person who knows how to run it isn't.
I mean, the good news is that the agent probably knows how to run itself pretty quickly. So
That's true. That's true. But what happens when something goes wrong? Or
yeah.
you need to
Well,
update something.
and I mean, all the way down to this, and I just wrote something about this not long ago, about this idea, like, okay, but who's responsible? Like
Yeah.
the AI agent goes out and does something crazy. like, is it the manager of that agent? Is it the
We touched on this
coworker, the
last time.
human? Is it the developer? Yeah, and it's the same thing. I mean, there's not an easy resolution, right?
No, no, and I think
It's just
I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anyone knows the answer to that. I think if it's not the shelf agent, as it were, I suspect the software company itself probably has some responsibility.
yeah. I
Whereas,
yeah,
the company,
yeah.
you've got to say if it's a self-developed DIY thing, um, probably the person that built
Yeah,
it.
well, here's my learning from implementing and putting in place a bunch of agents over the last couple months. But I've been trying different platforms and playing with things, and but part of what I've learned is that templates definitely have to think of them like a template, right? Like we used to, in the implementation world when I was involved in that, we used to talk about how this industry template makes the ERP system so much more accurate and effective for this vertical. But the truth was, it was never 100%. In fact, it was probably never 80%. It was probably more like 60%, 65%. Maybe it got better over time. But my point is that you still have to get it through the last few miles of its action. And that's true with the agents. The framework comes in and so how you would set it up. There's the perception of something that triggers the action. So you're looking for an email in the inbox. What does that do? That kicks off your workflow that takes it through some different actions it could take, depending on, it's an important email because it's from a client and blah blah, etc.
Yeah.
But you have to do a lot of that. Like it doesn't, even when it comes out of the box, it doesn't really work. Like I mean, there are things that do. Like the meeting recorder was pretty easy. I just put my Zoom, credentials in there and a few others, Google Meet, etc., and it worked fine. There's that one was 95% or 90% or something.
Yeah.
But my point is that's you're going to see that across everything. I can find the right agent, but then I'm going to have to do a lot of change to the agent to get to do what I want it to do. So at that point, is it still the vendor's responsibility or is it mine? And I don't
Yeah.
know.
Watch this space, folks. And it's
I mean, definitely, and I, it's Workday announced a workforce management kind of platform. I know Agentforce has some capabilities there. A lot of the other ServiceNow with their platform.
yeah.
So I don't know. It's a noisy, crazy change in space. Let's put it that way.
Remember I said understatement Fridays.
Yeah, I know, I know. Well, yeah, and you're speaking of understatements. I get a kick out of the next couple of things that I wanted to bring up because I don't know if you saw this, but Meta released Llama 4. Everybody was really excited about it, and the
Yeah.
benchmarks were fantastic. Like they were so much better than expected, right? And then somebody happened to notice that in the fine print they had replaced the regular release Llama 4 with a special, not released yet version that performed much better. Oops. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, I saw that. I assume the best, of course, and it was simply a
Well,
mistake.
I'm sure it was an accident, but
Yeah, but yeah, not ideal.
well, I mean, you can hear that conversation, right? Like, oh, that's not the best performing one. Here's the best performing one, and then because it's still called Llama 4, even though it has a special designation and isn't released. So, I mean, I could say that could just be a simple mistake. I don't know.
I mean, come on, we've all sent things to the wrong people, emails or whatever
You
it
know
is.
what? Yeah. No, that's
Uh,
absolutely fair. So I don't know. I don't know.
Sticking on the net.
But they were in the news again in the U.S. for another reason too,
Well, I was just about to say,
and again, I'm not going to talk the politics to this, yeah, but there was a testimony from a former employee that said that perhaps they had been sharing things with the Chinese government that they weren't supposed to be sharing about AI. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know the validity of that, except I did read through some of the transcript. But my undertone there was that you have to wonder any company that's going to do business in a country owes some. They have to go through some hoops with the government, and where do you draw the line? It gets really fuzzy and complicated, I think.
Yeah, sure. So this is Sarah Wynne Williams, isn't it? The former Meta
Uh-huh.
employee who wrote
Yep.
the book Careless People, I think it's called. It
Yeah.
is. You know what? I'm I do a lot of reading, but it's mostly researchy stuff. I don't read many books, to be frank, and that's one I am going to read. I am
Mm,
looking forward to reading it because I think it's just interesting, kind of hear what someone
yeah.
has to say. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is uh, fuzzy's a good way of putting it, and it's simply an extension of operating in different regulatory environments, right? So we're going to talk a little bit maybe about the new AI announcement from the European
Mm,
Union.
yeah.
So doing business with AI in Europe is subject to different rules doing business with AI in the
Mm,
United States of America. I'm not suggesting for one second, and like I said, let's still welcome politics, that it's a good or a bad thing. What's being talked about here, I'm simply saying it's got to be tricky,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
people make their own minds up about whether uh, that is the right or not the right thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting too because and you mentioned the EU announcement, and I was really curious about that too because if you remember, they had an AI act that took effect at the beginning of this year. So, and it was considerably more restrictive. I mean, I thought it was interesting because it was a risk-based system, but it was restrictive. And now it seems like they're trying to move more towards we want to be, leaders and most competitive. And also, of course, we've got some, you know, issues about, there are some researchers that are leaving the US because they're afraid of the environment right now. And so they're going to go to other countries. And maybe that's part of it. They thought they could attract some of those. I don't know. But I mean, I'm curious of your reaction to it because obviously you're closer to that than I am. But
Yeah, indeed. Physically, at least. We had a similar announcement from the UK government. Yeah, I think it was January, where we launched an AI kind of framework. I think there's a couple of really interesting things about it. I mean, there's a natural tension between kind of innovating at the edge and the necessity. And I do believe it's necessary to have regulation. I'm sorry, I just do. And it was interesting in the announcement. They talked about having like a service desk where people can kind of get in touch and talk about, does
mm,
this meet these standards, and is it okay to, because like the GDPR regulation, even if the product is built somewhere else, it's used by a European person
right.
in the European Union, then it's still subject to that European
Mm,
legislation. So I people fall on many different ends of that spectrum of yay regulation, nay regulation.
right. Yeah.
And I think the risk-based approach that the EU took initially, I'm
Yeah.
a little bit biased on this one. I'm working on a framework for this at the moment, and it's like outcomes-based, really. So
Hmm.
risk-based, outcome-based, for me, in my mind anyway, are very similar.
Mm,
You're not going to try and get into the nitty gritty of the technology itself because that's changing so fast. How can you? But what you can do is talk about the effect it could have.
yeah.
Um,
Well, and that's really important with another key point, right? The more you talk about agency and agentic and autonomous and autonomy, the more you are, in fact, raising the level of risk. Now, depends on what you're automating, of course. Like if you're automating some data entry task, then who cares? But, if you're automating some part of the medical diagnosis process, that's a different level of risk. I mean, I don't know.
yeah,
Yeah.
indeed. It brings me back to the 1980s classic. Was it 80s? War games. You know, if you're
Yeah.
automating the launch of nuclear
Yeah.
weapons,
Let's play thermonuclear war. I remember that quote very well.
that might not always end well.
I
So
would suspect not.
and here we go back in the world of science fiction, which you and I both love dearly.
Yeah.
Let's not go too far down this path.
Yeah,
But
well, the thing about it, it's kind of interesting counterpoint to what happened in the US, right? We had the executive orders put in by Biden's administration that was fairly restrictive, and I think in the industry viewed as very restrictive. And then the California regulations that were one that got voted down, that a lot of companies were very upset about because it was very restrictive. And we've gone the opposite direction, right? So in the U.S., they just basically did away with all those, and we've got David Sachs now in the White House as the AI czar to help us figure out what we're doing there, I guess. But we're not regulating, and I guess effectively we weren't really regulating before. We were doing it by executive order, which is different than passing a law. So, but it's definitely continues down the path of the Wild West in my mind. Yeah. And maybe that's
Yes.
good, maybe that's bad. I don't know, but it's just an observation.
Yeah, my instinct is probably a bit more negative on it, just given the sheer pervasiveness of AI in sort of just everything.
Mm.
Just everything. Whether it's kind of customer service, you're calling up your local power company, you're potentially talking to an intelligent kind of bot, or whether it's, as you said, medical diagnoses, or kind of autonomous weapons. I appreciate the argument. I understand the argument that the regulation can slow down innovation. But I also think there are bigger societal questions to be asked other than who can build this stuff the quickest.
Yeah. I mean,
Uh,
commercially, when I put that hat on, I think, oh well, no, that's what I want to know. How do we get to have the best as quick as possible? Of course, there is some other social side of this that we probably ought to take into account.
yes, call me old fashioned. I think it's probably true as well. No, and absolutely, and we'll see where we land with all of this. It's interesting though because you said about excuse me. There's two things I wanted to say just briefly on that, which were the first is I think the nice thing about the EU framework was one of the nice things I thought about was the idea that they're going to try and set up data centers to give more access to kind of what the
Yeah.
expensive resources we were talking about before,
Yeah,
which I think
encouraging a startup ecosystem, which I think is very important when it comes to competition. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
absolutely kind of helps level the playing field, which I think again in my mind is a good thing. And the second is, and it's just funny because I wrote a piece recently, just a short opinion piece called uh, AI is too big to fail. My argument being there is so much money in it, but it's not just money; it's also reputations and kind of effort. And I think there's a lot of people who've got a lot invested in this, not just money invested in it.
Yep.
So kind of unlocking the value, if it's possible, is kind of an important response to that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because if you think about this, and and I think we've created a momentum in the system. You know how sometimes that happens. Like when we switched to cloud, there was no momentum, and then we had the 2008 crash, and then there was a lot of momentum of people to get. They didn't have capex, so they had to spend opex. So they tried things that they maybe wouldn't have before, and whatever. And I think we're kind of getting there with the AI piece. I mean, when AI was a way to make a human smarter. So, in other words, just an assistant like the Copilot model was originally. It's changed since then. That's kind of one level of thing, and it's very valuable, and it was. But we're not really talking about that anymore because we've gone to the next step of where, within some continuum, that AI can do something.
Mhm.
And if you think about that from a small business perspective or mid-sized business perspective, all of a sudden the value proposition changed dramatically. If it works, which it does. Then the idea that I can use agentic AI as a way to level a competitive playing field, because I can't afford to hire more resources, but I could afford to add extra 10 bots or whatever, right? I mean, 10 agents, I should call them, not bots. I, it's interesting. And I think you're right. It's too big to fail in a different way, but I think it's also because of the fact that now there's so much momentum that so many companies are trying it and some putting it in production that it's just going to perpetuate itself. And whenever there's opportunity to make money, like this level of making money, the companies are going to go there, right? I mean, that's just the way the market works.
Yes, rightly or wrongly. Yes. Again, I keep saying yes a lot on this particular.
Yeah, I
No,
like it that you're agreeing. I mean, that's good.
I was probably more interested if I disagree, but I mean, again, we are steering away from politics. We're not doing
Yeah,
politics on this conversation.
we are definitely a technology podcast. So,
So there's just no point in getting into it. And I do think, kind of lowering the barriers to entry is a good thing, whether that's for people consuming the technology or people trying to innovate the technology with the technology, and anything that can do grows accessibility, levels the
yeah,
playing field, I think is a good thing. Now, and back to my point about, there's our societal questions and regulation is important. There are also questions that, to your point very directly, I can't necessarily afford to hire 10 people, but I can hire 10 bots. But I could have hired 2 people. What happens to those jobs?
yeah,
And
yeah.
that kind of question, because obviously if we're looking at the bottom line only, then some things can happen.
Well, and I think the now that eventually I will put the disclaimer on what I'm going to say next is that eventually I don't know that this is true, but for right now, I think that we're holding strong to the idea that we have some sort of a AI human collaboration involved in this. And the level of human involvement changes dramatically as the agent gets more autonomous and more agency,
Yep.
which is the scary thing until you layer in, yes, but you have to test and make sure you trust those, and then you're moving incrementally through that. And so, I mean, there are ways to mitigate those risks. And I would say, if you're a business thinking about it, don't just think like, oh, I'm just going to get this bot and put it into place, right? I've got to make sure I understand my processes. I've got to make sure I've got data nailed, because it won't work without the data. I've got to make sure that I have some way to protect my enterprise data from the language model. So am I using RAG? Am I using rare? Am I whatever? So I mean, it's one of those things that it's going to get a certain level of formalization through failure, I think, right? I mean, unfortunately that's what happens when you when you rush into something maybe without having thought everything through. Yeah.
No, indeed. I think there's one other point I'd make on that subject, which is I think companies, organizations adopting this stuff need to think very carefully about how their workforces will feel about it.
Yeah, fair.
Because, it will be seen by some as a threat.
Yeah.
And if you, so we're getting all in on AI and doing this and doing this and doing this. I wouldn't expect to get the best out of my employees as a result necessarily.
Right.
Just so.
Well, I mean, I think as I've tried to write some frameworks and guides about how to do this, how to think of the strategy, how to think this through, it comes back to one of the most simple things. And I would have said this, 30 years ago, implementing software any more than I would today. And that is that you've got to make sure you're bringing what employees you want to have and you want to keep along as a part of the process, not as not leaving them out of that communication, but helping them understand what this means to them and where this will help them, and whatever. If you plan to keep them, I mean, I guess if you're not going to do that, then maybe that's a different discussion. But
Uh,
but my point is that you've got to have that change management plan and the process, or you're right. You're never going to bring your employees along, and you're going to
yeah,
have a revolt at some point.
yeah. Yeah, indeed. And we talked about shadow IT not that long
Yeah.
ago. Shadow
Yeah.
AI.
Shadow
uh,
AI. Well, that is actually a discussion point. It's interesting because I've seen that used a couple of times recently, and more we're starting to hear that. And if you think about the nature of the way a lot of this happened, I'm sure there's a lot of shadow AI, and I'm sure that companies would be very upset if they knew how much data leakage there has been. Um,
yeah, I have no reason to doubt that either.
yeah. Yeah. Well,
Just
but
again,
the good news is it's going to get so expensive pretty soon that maybe not as many people will do it, right? Because if it's $20 a month, then it's cheap. But if you're, now at the top level at OpenAI, you're paying 200 a month, and if you're now at the top level of Anthropic, you're paying 200 a month. That's the late announcements. So I mean, it is those personal tools which you can think of them in both ways. You could have a program that uses those Anthropic, Claude, or ChatGPT or whatever, and those can be a part of of an enterprise solution, but they could also be a part of a thing I've got in my pocket that I'm using to do my work, help me with my work without having blessings from the company. And that's where you've got the shadow AI
yeah.
worry anyway. But I don't know.
With IT, it was never thus, right? I think it's like I use my own. We had this whole debate about who had which mobile device we were meant to use, our own personal device or whether it's a company device. We had mobile device management solutions and security solutions. And I think the same is true, to your point, very much so. I think in terms of what data may have made its way to places that perhaps it will not to have, I think is a serious concern.
Yeah, I think so. And the other thing, and I want to make sure because we are getting close to running out of time. There was one more thing I wanted to make sure we mentioned, and we should probably put this down as a thing to talk about next time too, because I'm really curious about how we look at this. But Adobe Summit was recently. They had made a bunch of agentic announcements, platform and customer experience orchestration, which plays right into my old I hate customer journey mapping ideas because it's static and not real time and not reactive and interactive and whatever. And this addresses some of those things. Although the one thing I will say about Adobe is that they're always very careful because of the creatives that are a lot of their customer base to make sure that the human's very much prominent in the loop. But nonetheless, and then Canva's conference was right after that. They announced a whole bunch of new AI features, which I haven't heard any feedback yet, but I suspect we'll get some pushback from some creatives because the more you build in agentic AI and image generation, et cetera, into the thing, so it'll create a spreadsheet for me now, and it'll make a new presentation for me now, and all I have to do is describe what I want. And I mean, there are certainly people that'll feel threatened by that, I guess was my point.
Absolutely, we have definitely not got time to get even close to
No, but I definitely would like to save that one for next time, because I think that's an interesting one from a creative person perspective. And I mean, obviously we're both content generators and have been doing that for a long time, so we have a vested interest in some of that anyway. So
yeah, well, I mean, I was reading a news article the other day on one of the it was about market moves and stuff like that, and this article was automatically generated by blah 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 blah. And yeah. You and I
well, you are starting to see that more and more on certain types of news sites, especially local news sites that don't have the money for staffing anymore because their business model's been destroyed. And I suspect you will see that continue. And I mean, at some level, there's probably some value in some of that local coverage that you just simply wouldn't have if you didn't do that. So there could be positives in there somewhere.
Assuming it gets it right.
But it will. Remember, we already talked about how we're going to make RAG better. And
as ever, I draw inspiration from your optimism.
Very nice. Well, and on that note, that's all the time we have today. So again, I'm Michael Fauscette.
I'm Tom Pringle.
And that's this month's AI Pulse. And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining us. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the show. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a review to help others find us. For more research on AI and other software, check out arianresearch.com. If you're an expert in AI, generative AI, or business automation, either as a provider or an end user, email your information to disambiguation@arianresearch.com. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arian Research production. I'm Michael Fauscette, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.